Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, in this short video, we're going to be going over an introduction to the science of Tajweed. So as Muhammad ibn Ali al-Sabban, who is a great Egyptian scholar, he mentions in these famous lines of poetry, the introduction and the stepping stones for every single science or any science are 10, meaning that these are 10 things that anybody who plans or is studying a specific Islamic science should know about that science. They should know these 10 things. إن مبادئ كل علم عشرة الحد والموضوع ثم الثمرة ونسبته فضل الواضع والاسم وصدان حكم الشارع مسائل وبعض اكتفى ومن درى جميع هذا شرفا. Muhammad he mentions in these lines of poetry that the introduction to any single science are 10. Al-Had, the definition. You want to know the definition of a science before studying or while studying it at the very least. So we're going to be covering in this video the definition of Tajweed. Likewise, we're going to be covering Al-Mawdu'. Al-Mawdu' is the realm, the topic that this science deals with. Likewise, you need to know Al-Thamara, the fruit that comes out of it. So what's the fruit that comes out of you studying Tajweed? Likewise, in Nisbatuhu, you need to understand the correlation that this science has with other sciences in Islam. Fadluhu, you also need to understand the greatness of this science. Wanwada, you should also understand the founder of this science. So who is the one who founded the science of Tajweed? Wal ism, you need to know also its name. Sometimes one science can have more than one name. Wal istimdad, you also need to understand the source. From where do we get this knowledge from? Hukm al-shari', you should also understand the Islamic ruling on this science. Masail, you should also understand the different topics and issues that this science deals with. So these are the 10 things we're going to be covering concerning Tajweed. Its definition, its topic, its fruit, and so on and so forth. So starting off with the definition of Tajweed. The definition of Tajweed, linguistically, Tajweed is the masdar of jawwada yujawwidu, which means to beautify something. So Tajweed means beautification. Linguistically, Tajweed means beautification. But in terms of a science from the sciences of Islam, it is that you pronounce each letter from its point of articulation while giving it its right. Okay, is that you pronounce every single letter from its point of articulation while giving it its right. So Tajweed, in terms of an Islamic science, is a science that's going to teach you how to pronounce every single letter from its proper point of articulation while at the same time giving it its right. And why is this science called Tajweed? Because by you doing this, by you pronouncing every single letter from its proper point of articulation and giving it its right, you're going to beautify your recitation, right? And that's the goal of Tajweed, is to beautify your recitation and also to make sure that you're reciting it the way that Allah told you to, which is وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرْتِيلًا. Allah told us in the Quran to recite the Quran with tartil, which is making the letters very clearly, reciting it in its proper way, the way that Prophet ﷺ was reciting it. So now the question is, what is meant here by giving it its right? What is the right of a letter? What is the right of a letter? What is the right of a letter? The right of a letter is that it be pronounced from its proper point of articulation while giving it its proper characteristic, its proper sifa. So the right of a letter is pretty much that you do tahqiq al-makhraj. You make sure that you're properly pronouncing it, while at the same time you're giving it its haqq, its characteristic, its sifa, its right. Okay? So now the question is, what exactly is meant here by the characteristic of a letter? What does the characteristic of a letter mean? Sifatu harf, the characteristic of a letter, is a condition that happens to the letter while it's being pronounced that distinguishes it from other letters. Okay, so when you're studying Tajweed, you're going to hear a lot of times, inshallah, sifat and huruf. Sifat and huruf, the qualities or the attributes or the characteristics of letters. So what does this mean? What do they mean when, teachers, Quran teachers and so on and so forth, they say the sifat and huruf? What they mean by that is that a specific condition that's going to happen to a letter while it's being pronounced, and that condition is going to distinguish it from other letters a lot of times. And one letter can have more than one sifa, can have more than one characteristic. So I'm just going to give an example here. So we have two letters that many times people, they confuse, the sad and the sin. Many times people have a difficulty distinguishing the difference between a sad and a sin. So the difference between these two letters is not in terms of their point of articulation. Both the Sad and the Sin come from pretty much the same point of articulation in your mouth. Als, S, als, S. If you do that, you're going to clearly see that your tongue, the tip of your tongue does not really change. It's at the same exact location for both the als and for the S. So what makes these two letters different is not the point of articulation, but rather it's its characteristic. So the specific characteristics that the Sad has makes it different than the Sin. And what are these characteristics? These characteristics are, again, the conditions that happen to the Sad or that happen to the Sin while it's being pronounced that distinguishes it from the other pretty much. So for the Sad, we have al-Ista'ana and al-Itbaq. And Ista'ana means that the sound of the letter goes up in your mouth. Als, als, als. The sound is going up in my mouth. While al-Itbaq means that the sound, not only does it go up in your mouth, but it gets stuck between your upper palate and your tongue. So you're saying als, als, you can see that it's as if the sound and the air is sort of getting stuck to a certain extent between your upper palate and your tongue. On the other hand, the Sin has al-istifan and al-infitah and al-infitah. Al-istifan means that the sound goes down. When you're saying S, you're going to see that the sound is going down. S. And likewise, it has al-infitah. The sound is not getting stuck anywhere in your mouth. It's just really flowing out. S, unlike all. So that is the difference between the Sad and the Sin. It doesn't have to do necessarily with its point of articulation, but rather has to do with the specific Sifa, the specific characteristic that the Sad or the Sin has. So when we say that Tajweed is in terms of its science, is that you pronounce each letter from its point of articulation, right, in your mouth, while giving it its right, yani while making sure that you're giving every single letter its proper characteristic. For the Sad, the air is going up or the sound's going up in your mouth and it's getting stuck a bit. For the Sin, the sound's going down and it's not getting stuck at all. So you want to make sure that when you're assigning these two letters with proper tajweed, that will mean that you're making sure that the Sad and the Sin are coming from the proper point of articulation and you're giving each and every single letter its proper sifa, its proper right. Moving on, now that we understand the definition of tajweed, al-mawdu'. What is the topic in the realm that tajweed deals with? Tajweed deals with the words of the Quran. Tajweed deals with the words of the Quran. So the Quran is made up of surah, made up of chapters. Those chapters are made up of ayat, are made up of verses. Those verses are made up of words. And obviously those words are made up of letters. So that is a topic in the realm that Tajweed deals with. Athamara, what is the fruit that comes out of you actually studying Tajweed? First and foremost, it protects you from mistakes, what they call lahan. Protects you from mistakes while reciting the Quran that can change the meaning, and sometimes it won't change the meanings, but there's still mistakes. And obviously, you want to make sure that we're reciting the Quran the proper way that it's supposed to be recited, and that we're not changing its meaning. Because we know that if someone's reciting Surah Al-Fatiha without proper tajweed, and thus he changes the meaning, it can sometimes change the meaning in a dramatic way. So for example, if we say Iyaka na'budu without a shadda on the ya there, it can mean I worship yani the sun rays or the rays that come from the sun. So I have to make sure that I'm giving the ya there its proper haq, right? I have to make sure that I'm pronouncing it its proper way while giving it its proper rights. So it protects you from mistakes that can sometimes even change the meaning of the Quran. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ says that, or the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, the one who is proficient in the recitation of the Quran will be with the honorable and obedient scribes, the angels. And he who recites the Quran and finds difficulty to recite it, doing his best to recite it in the best way possible, will have two rewards. So by us learning tajweed and being proficient in our recitation of the Quran, inshallah, we'll be with the honorable, obedient scribes, the angels, inshallah. Moving on. Nisbatuhu, its correlation with other sciences, is one of the sciences of the Quran. So anybody who wants to get closer to the Quran and wants to better understand the Quran, which is, the greatest miracle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that was given to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then this person needs to, no doubt, study tajweed because it's one of the sciences of the Quran. فضله, its greatness. What's the greatness of you learning, or what's the greatness of tajweed, if you will? So it's there by Uthman ibn Affan anhu, that the Prophet Muhammad said, خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه. The famous narration, the best amongst you is the one who learns the Quran and teaches it. So there's nothing better, there's no one that's better than the person who learns the Quran. And once you've learned the Quran, once you study Tajweed, once you're able to teach it, then you teach it to others. And you teach the Quran both in terms of its mabana, in terms of its wording, and likewise in terms of its ma'ana, in terms of its meaning. This should be our goal when it comes to those of us that are memorizing the Quran or teaching the Quran and so on and so forth. Al-Wadi', who's the founder of the science of Tajweed? Who's the founder of the science of Tajweed? From a practical aspect, the Prophet Muhammad it's his founder. He is the one who recited the Quran while giving every single letter its point of articulation and giving it its right. So from a practical aspect, from an application aspect, the Prophet Muhammad of course, is the founder, quote unquote, of the science of Tajweed. So by reciting the Quran with the proper application of the rules, the Prophet is the founder of the science of Tajweed from the practical aspect of him reciting the Quran with the proper applications of the rules. On the other hand, from a theory aspect, in terms of us actually studying the science of Tajweed from a theoretical aspect and studying these different characteristics, and who are the people that came up with these different characteristics that I just mentioned, for example, for the Sad, right? Who said that the Sad has an isti'ana and an itbaq? Of course, that's not the Prophet Muhammad who came and gave those specific terminologies. Rather, the scholars of the Arabic language, and likewise the reciters of the Quran, they're the ones who, by studying and documenting the rules of recitation, they pretty much created, quote unquote, from a theory aspect, the science of Tajweed. So the terminology that we use, right, and the classification that we have, but obviously they got that from the recitation of the Prophet Muhammad. In terms of the name of the science is Ilm Tajweed, the science of Tajweed. And in terms of al-istimdad, the source, well, the source of Tajweed is the recitation of the Prophet Muhammad, which was transmitted to us by the Sahabas and then the reciters who came after them. So that's how we get the source. So for example, these scholars that we just mentioned, the scholars of the Arabic language and reciters of the Quran, we said that they were able to document these rules and so on and so forth from the recitation of the Prophet. But obviously, a lot of these scholars of the Arabic language and a lot of these reciters of the Quran, they never heard the recitation of the Prophet Muhammad. So how are they able to know this? Well, they're unable to know this because the recitation of the Prophet has been transmitted to us with tawatur by the Sahabas and then the reciters who came after them. And that's what ijazah, right? When we have an ijazah, a person has an ijazah, that means that that person has a sanad, right? Has a chain of narration that goes from him and his teacher to a long list of individuals that go back to Sahaba and that go back to Prophet Muhammad. So we have a clear chain that makes sure that the recitation of people is the same exact recitation of their teacher, who took it from their teacher, who took it from the teacher, that goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. In terms of the Islamic ruling of Tajweed, from a practical aspect, if you're applying the rules when reciting the Quran, it's an individual obligation. It's fardu ayn. Every single Muslim needs to learn proper tajweed in order to recite the Quran and recite Surah Al-Fatiha in their prayer the proper way. And if someone does not learn this, then that person is sinful. Because it's obligatory for us to recite the Quran the way Allah told us, وَرَتِّلِ الْقُرْآنَ تَرَتِيلًا. Allah says, recite the Quran in a measured, clear, proper way, quote unquote. From a theory aspect, you're actually learning the rules and the classification and the sifat, the characteristics of the letters. That's a communal obligation. It's fardu kifaya. A group of the community needs to make sure that they learn this in order to be able to transmit it to the preceding or to the following generation. But it's not obligatory for every single Muslim to know all the different sifat of the huruf and so on and so forth. But of course, to get the practical aspect, there's no doubt that you need to have a certain amount of the theory aspect. Then finally, the different issues that it deals with. The science of Tajweed more or less deals with three things. It deals with makharij al-huruf, the point of articulations. So where does the sheen come from in your mouth? Where does the sin come from? Where does the sad come from? the different parts of articulation. Likewise, it deals with sifat and huruf, the characteristics of the letters. And we covered that the characteristics of the letters are pretty much the conditions that happen to the letters while they're being pronounced that distinguishes them from other letters. So for example, we have the characteristic of at-tafashi, which is the spreading of the airflow and sound in the mouth, which only happens with the letter sheen. Ash, ash. Then likewise, Tajweed also deals with tafa'ulun huruf, the interaction between the letters, okay? The effect that happens when certain letters come next to each other. So for example, this is where we have al-mad, right? The elongation of certain letters. So when this letter comes before, for example, a hamza, then the letter is going to be elongated this much haraka, right? This is, again, the interaction that happens between the two letters. Or for example, we have the rule of al-qalb. What's al-qalb? Al-qalb is that you change a nun with a sukoon on it, or the tanween, to a meme if it's followed by a ba. So this is the interaction that's happening between the two letters. So based on the rules of Tajweed, if you have a nun sakin or a nun sakina and it's followed by a meme, they're going to change it to a ba. So because of the interaction between these two letters, the nun sakina and the meme, something's going to happen. That's also something that Tajweed deals with. So if you study all these three things, then pretty much you've studied the different issues, the major issues, I should say, that Tajweed covers. So with that, we've covered the 10 different things that we need to make sure that we understand before or at least while we're studying Tajweed.